This is a webinar regarding grant funding for agricultural runoff pollution abatement. My name is Mike Gilbertson. I'm the statewide Ag Nonpoint Source Implementation Coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. This presentation is going to talk about some of the background of our Nonpoint Source Pollution Abatement Program. Is going to talk about where some of the requirements that addresses grant funding and requirements for runoff pollution abatement, and then I'll go over some of the grant funding options for ag producers in Wisconsin. So a little background on our statewide Nonpoint Source Pollution Abatement Program. This is a statewide program focused on reducing or preventing polluted runoff from reaching waters of the state that is not regulated by a permit. Non-point source pollution is the leading cause of water quality problems in Wisconsin. Around 75% of impaired waters are due to non-point source pollution. And when we talk about non-point source pollution, we're not just talking about agricultural pollution sources. Non-point source pollution in Wisconsin also includes urban sources. Our non-point source pollution abatement program is a multi-agency commitment to implement the program. With the County Land and Water Conservation Departments, the Wisconsin Department of Agricultural, Trade, and Consumer Protection, and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources all work together to implement programs to implement the program to reduce non-point source pollution in Wisconsin. One of the important components of this collaboration is that implementation of the non-point source program is expected at the county level or at the local level, and that's an important part of this program for success. We have requirements for abating non-point source pollution. These requirements were established in state statute in the late 90s and have been amended over time and have changed over time. But these regulations, and focusing particularly on agriculture, these regulations are for all farms to control runoff and protect waters of the state. So farms of all sizes, cropland and livestock producers all have requirements to reduce their non-point source pollution and prevent discharges of pollution to waters of the state. These state statutes also set up cost share requirements for farms to meet the regulations. That cost sharing would be used to install practices to collect runoff and prevent runoff from reaching waters of the state. There are statutes that require, in many cases, cost sharing for installing these practices. The state statutes also established a funding source. It set up rules that describe our grant programs, which I'll talk about in a few slides here. The different types of grants and some of the rules and how the grant program is supposed to be utilized. Again, it sets up rules for funding practices that or set up rules for cost sharing the practices that are used to reduce the runoff and comply with our state requirements. So best management practices, BMPs is a term that we use that describes those things that are installed to address runoff. For example, manure storage, roofs over barnyards, milk house waste collection. These are all best management practices that can be used where there are situations that runoff from farms is reaching waters of the state or potentially reaching waters of the state, and could be installed to reduce that risk of runoff to waters of the state and protect our water resources. And Wisconsin provides grant funding to install management practices for controlling agricultural runoff. And an example showing on the pictures here is potential runoff from a barnyard and a potential solution for collecting the runoff to be handled differently and reduce the risk of runoff reaching waters of the state. So when you talk about cost sharing, specifically from Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, there's a couple non-point source grant options that are used to implement best management practices on farms to collect runoff and come into compliance with state requirements, with state regulations. The first one I'll talk about here is the Targeted Runoff Management Grant Program, or TRIM, we often refer to. TRIM grants are for ag producers to install best management practices to voluntarily comply with state regulations. The TRIM grant can fund up to 70% of the cost of the best management practice. And that 70% is, in most cases, that 70%, that percentage of cost share is actually part of the statute that was written for our grant programs. There's two types of TRIM grants. We have small scale TRIM grants or projects. For example, let's say one farm, it would be a project on one farm where the maximum is a $225,000 grant award. So in a situation where a farm may have a situation of runoff from, let's say, a barnyard, as we've shown in earlier pictures, the local land conservation department, the county conservation department would work with the farmer to come up with a plan to address that runoff. And then the county would apply for a TRIM grant from the Department of Natural Resources. And then the DNR would issue the funding to the county to reimburse the installation of a practice to address that runoff on one farm, for example. And that would be a situation for a small scale TRIM grant. The other type of TRIM grant we have is a large scale TRIM grant. And in this situation, this would be for example, multiple farms in a watershed. So it'd be a larger scale, and it could be used to address and install practices to collect runoff to come into compliance with state regulations. And the maximum award for this grant is $600,000. These grants are eligible to extend over 4 years. And the idea here is that a county would work closely with multiple farms in an area that are voluntarily installing practices to collect runoff and prevent or reduce the risk of runoff from reaching waters of the state. Again, targeted runoff management grants are voluntary, but the intent of these grants is for farmers to install practices and collect runoff and to comply with state regulations. The second non-point source grant option that the DNR provides is called the Notice of Discharge grant. Notice of Discharge grants are for agricultural producers that have a direct discharge of pollutants to waters of the state. In this situation, this is a requirement for producers where they have a documented discharge to waters of the state. With a Notice of Discharge grant, these are required. The producers are required to fix the discharge, and that's different than a TRIM grant. A TRIM grant is a voluntary compliance. With notices of discharge, they are required to fix the discharge. Again, the money used from a Notice of Discharge grant would be used to install a practice such as manure storage, a collection system, a roof over a barnyard, for example, to address whatever is the discharge that has reached waters of the state. Another difference with Notice of Discharge grants is that they don't have a cap on the amount of the grant award. So whatever the amount is needed to fix the discharge, address the discharge, there is no cap on the amount of the grant awarded, but it is awarded again through the county, and that would be used as a reimbursement to the landowner for installing the practice. Again, through statute, there is a requirement that at least 70% of the cost of the best management practice is covered by the Notice of Discharge grant. In addition, in those cases where the producer has shown economic hardship conditions, they are eligible for 90% of the cost of the practice to be covered through a notice of discharge, grant. We typically have on average about $1.5 million annually available for NOD, notice of discharge grants, and these can be applied for throughout a year, throughout the year. So, we can get applications at 3 different time periods in April, June, August, and October are all time periods, are 4 different time periods where notice of discharge grants can be where applications for grants can be submitted. And depending on the cost sharing available, those that we can cover the cost of are awarded at that time. In the situation where we don't have enough money available throughout the year to go towards a notice of discharge grant to fix a project, that producer is not required to install the practice until the 70% or 90% of the cost of the practice is available. And where applications aren't covered with amount of funding potentially, those applications are kept or batched together for a future round until we do have the funding available. So again, a notice of discharge grant is required. They are required to comply, install practices to comply with our state requirements and fix the discharge. At least 70% of the cost of the practice is covered with an NOD grant, and in times where a producer is showing economic hardship, 90% of the cost of the practice can be covered with a notice of discharge grant. So who do you contact for other questions on our Wisconsin Department of Natural Resource grant options to address agricultural runoff pollution? We have 8 regional non-point source coordinators throughout the state that cover a set counties in their region, and they are all contacts for both TRIM grants, NOD grants, and in general, statewide requirements for addressing agricultural runoff to abate the pollution from reaching waters of the state. Those contacts are listed here. And if you have any other questions, statewide questions in general about the program, you can also contact me. My contact information is on the first slide. Thank you.